Hi folks, I'm Megan from Fireside Farms, and today I am up-potting Amaranth and Quinoa and a couple kales, and I figured I'd take you guys along with me and explain the whole up-potting process and why you would want to up-pot instead of just transplant directly out into your garden. Later on today, we'll be planting some beans and some gourds. Look at these seeds. Look at these seed packets I got from Southern Exposure Seed Exchange, which I'll link down below. These were a late purchase, obviously, but I'm going to plant the rattlesnake pole beans on my property fence line because I think they can take the full sun, and the gourds I'm not sure about yet. I need to do a bit more research on whether the gourds can tolerate the New Mexico heat and sun, which is very, very different from the full sun that seed companies talk about on their packets. But if not, I'll have to put them on one of the trellises inside the garden instead of on the perimeter gate. Now let's up-pot this amaranth. So I hope you guys can see me and hear me. The wind is kind of bad. I'm on my back porch. I was trying to get enough natural light and avoid the wind, but the wind is everywhere. But in this tray, Jesus. Sounded like the chicken just died. I want to say about 2 to 3 weeks ago, I started these seeds right here. Hopi Red Dye Amaranth, which I believe I got from Baker Creek. I don't remember where I got these seeds, but these are the brightest brilliant quinoa, these green ones right here. And this is also amaranth. This is the vegetative, I guess you can call it, version, the one that you would use for lettuces rather than the seeds that you would use these for. I don't remember the name right now, but I'll put it at the bottom of the screen. And then this is dinosaur kale, I believe. Or no, sorry. This is lacinato kale, and I just planted these. So normally I would not recommend you start kale so late in the spring, especially in a desert environment like mine. But last year I did have kale in my bed that did not bolt until I want to say it was August. At that point it didn't taste real great. It was fairly bitter, but it had not bolted yet. It was surrounded by plants that had grown taller during the summer. I think there was amaranth and okra in that bed, and that really extended the life of the kale. So I'm gonna try that again this year. I don't know what bed I'm gonna put it in yet, but it's here. If not, I'll just grow it inside. I love kale. I love making kale chips, and I have a shelf with lights, so it's not a problem either. So what exactly is up-potting? Freya. Up-potting is simply when you take a plant in one pot or a tray like this and move it into a larger pot to give it more room to grow. In the case of vegetable gardens, a couple reasons why you might want to up-pot. If the holes are large enough, then you can usually see if the plant is becoming root bound. Or if there's just an extensive amount of roots spilling out of the bottom, it's definitely probably time to get this guy either out into the garden or into a bigger pot. Another reason, if you start your vegetable seedlings or any seedlings early, before the last frost, so that they are larger when you transplant them out into the spring, they may grow too large and you will have to up-pot them before there is a last frost. So you obviously will not transplant out a tomato seedling when there's still frost in the forecast, but if it's getting too big for its current container and it's going to be damaged by being stunted, then you probably need to up-pot it if you have the space and the soil and the pots to do so. Now in this case, in the case of my amaranth and quinoa, I am not up-potting them necessarily because they need to be. it's just gonna be a personal preference of mine. So we've already had our last frost. My entire vegetable garden is planted out. I started these late. These are getting a late start. But Amaranth and Quinoa are very, very fragile. Let me show you. Amaranth and Quinoa are pretty fragile seedlings. They get thick stalks as they grow. But at this stage, they are very, very fragile. As you can see, even they've already been hardened off. I actually grew them outdoors in these trays. But the wind that I have here has already damaged some of these. Not permanently, they'll be fine. But they're all bent and wonky. And their stems are just really, really fragile. So if I were to plant these out in my garden, the seedlings could snap, bend, and just be permanently wonky for the rest of the season. I also have a pretty bad grasshopper problem. I haven't identified exactly which plants they always target. Zinnias, they love zinnias. They love amaranth and quinoa. So I can plant out a seedling this young, and the next day the entire top will be shaved off from grasshoppers that ate it. Up potting them and allowing them to get bigger before I transplant them outside just gives them a better chance of living, because if they do get beheaded by a grasshopper, they'll die. There's no recovering from that. So the couple things you are gonna need to do this are obviously your plants that you're up potting, a slightly bigger pot. So the reason you don't want a super large pot for this little guy is the amount of water it's going to take just to water, because he's only got tiny little roots, and if you stick him in a huge pot, you're gonna be using a lot of water for just this little guy. So just put them in a slightly larger pot, enough to get the job done until it is time to put them outside. And also that way you're using less soil, you're saving money. So I use Fox Farm potting soil for starting seedlings, up potting, and basically everything indoors. I don't use it outside of my beds, it's kind of pricey. This is not an advertisement, I'm not at all associated with Fox Farm. I really do like their potting soil. It's a bit on the pricier side. This is a 3 cubic foot bag, and I think it was a little under 30 bucks. But I have excellent seedling health with this potting soil. And since I just use it to start seeds and then do a couple small pots before I transplant out into my garden, I'm not using a large quantity where I wouldn't be able to justify the cost of 1 or 2 bags a year, which is about what I go through. Now, if you all use a sterile seed starting mix or just a regular seed starting mix, that is perfectly fine. I prefer to use a potting soil just because I can get a little lazy and leave my seedlings in their seed trays for longer than I should. That's not totally safe and possible with seed starting mix because there are no additional nutrients in that mix. So, you know, once those seedlings get about their first true leaves, they're running out of food, and you'll need to up pot them then. But when you use a potting mix with nutrients in it, then you can wait a little longer. So that's what I do. So what I'm just gonna do is fill these with some soil. As you can see, these are used pots. Freya. As you can see, these are used pots. They're dirty. All of them. I have never had a problem with disease being transferred to new seeds when I start them, but it is possible. So just be aware of that. So fill these with soil. Now I like to leave about half of it empty because 1 block of this is going inside this pot. So you can move the soil out and stick it in. It's just easier if you leave half of the soil out. a quick note on transplanting and uppotting in general. Okay, take a look at this sad little quinoa here. So this first leaf, it even still has the seed head on it, if you can see right there. These are their true leaves. Those are the first leaves that come out when the stem emerges from the ground. Then come a second pair of leaves. These are called the true leaves. You do not want to transplant a seedling before it has at least one set of true leaves. It's just not strong enough yet. So I usually wait until at least it has 2 sets of true leaves before transplant. I've just had better luck that way. But in an emergency, you can do it, especially with tomato seedlings, because they're super easy to transplant and very, very resilient. So there are going to be instances when you don't want to uppot your seedlings, and that's mostly going to be in the case of plants that don't like their roots disturbed, such as squash, watermelon, peas, beans, those kinds of plants sensitive to transplant and root disturbance. Number one, you may not have a whole lot of luck starting them in trays like this anyways, because you will inevitably cause root disturbance. Those plants are better suited for something like peat pots, or you can do DIY biodegradable pots with toilet paper rolls and paper. I actually have a blog post about that, which I'll link down below. But in those instances, if you had no other choice than to start them in a tray like this, you don't want to uppot them because it will create twice the root disturbance. And in order to minimize that, just do it once. Once they get big enough, transplant them out directly into the garden. Just have that one disturbance, and hopefully they do well and don't stunt too badly. So in those cases, you don't want to uppot your plants. In most other cases where the plants are not sensitive to root disturbance, that is totally fine. Not always necessary, as I explained earlier, but an option. Typically with most of my seeds, I use a method called the multi-sow method. I didn't invent it, and I will link a good video down below to teach you more about that. But essentially what I do is I sow multiple seeds in one block here. See, so you can see there's 4 amaranth plants here, 3 here, 2 here. That saves me both soil cost, because I'm using obviously less soil and less trays for the same amount of plants, and it saves me on space. Maybe you only have 1 or 2 grow lights and you can't afford to have 5 trays full of plants because there's not enough space under the grow lights. You can just sow more plants in one block. This doesn't work for all plants. For tomatoes, it works very, very well. Peppers as well. Amaranth and quinoa are a bit tricky. I don't have a whole lot of fun separating these out because they're so frail, and their roots are super, super frail too. I've had on more than one occasion trying to gently coax them apart and just ripped one in half. But I get enough of a good result that I still multi-sow both quinoa and amaranth. So I will show you how to do that. The same as you would have with a single plant in one block, you're just going to remove the entire block. I'm turning this over to gently coax them out. Ooh. Well, that's one way. Okay, so let's see if you can focus on this. So they're still in the block here, but hopefully you can see there's roots coming out of this whole block of soil. So what I'm gonna do is just try and separate each seedling into one hand and just kind of work the soil. I do not rip, but I let the roots fall away from each other. And now I have 2 separate masses of roots with their corresponding seedlings. So as I pulled this guy away, some of the dirt fell off, but his roots are still intact, so that looks good. Now you can try and dig a deeper hole in here just to make sure the roots go down. It doesn't matter a whole lot, they will eventually reach back downwards, especially if you bottom water. Just don't have them up above exposed to the air. Make sure they're underneath soil. Let me show you guys what I just accidentally did. It happens to all of us. So, if you can see this here, I just beheaded this little guy, trying to simultaneously work the bottom of the tray cell, and pull up on this guy's head. So, he's definitely dead. I even got some of his roots. Just as a warning, be gentle if you are trying to pull seedlings out from their stem. It's generally not recommended, but you can do it with them. So in cases like this, where there are extensive root systems all intertwined with one another, and these are pretty large seedlings, I may not be able to separate them without breaking off some very large roots. So in this case, I might lose a few, that's fine. I'll just try and save the largest one I can with the largest root system. And hopefully, if the soil's not holding the roots together, the roots will just fall away from one another without too much damage. Alright, so I have this big one right here and this big one right here, and I think I've got some long roots here on this guy. He might be okay. And then I have these two. I have some pretty high tension here between these sets of roots, and I think that if I pull too hard, I'm going to rip one. I would prefer not to kill both of them, so I'm just gonna cut one of these plants off at the top of the stem, essentially killing him and leaving the other one the space to grow. I usually start my seeds on the floor of the garage like a little gremlin, but y'all have me doing it on this table out here and I'm losing all kinds of soil. Y'all can see the difference that uppotting makes in space. What those 8 cells were has now turned into that, which is actually going to take up 2 of these whole trays just to hold them so that I can bottom water, because I do bottom water all my seedlings. So what was once an empty grow shelf is now going to be full again. These guys right here are butterfly weed and a couple zinnias I haven't transplanted out yet. But these are all the amaranth. This is the lettuce amaranth, the Hopi red dye, the brilliant brightest quinoa, I believe. And it's these 3 trays. These are actual seedling trays. But in a pinch, if you guys run out, you see these are little throwaway baking trays. You get like 2 for $1 at the dollar store, so they're super convenient. Hey guys, it's the end of the day. I had forgotten that I had a work appointment I had to take care of during the day, but I did want to show you guys all of the amaranth and quinoa that I transplanted out. I did not get the kale done, but that's only going to add about 3 more pots. But this is just to illustrate how one tiny tray of seedlings can turn into something that may not fit under your grow shelf anymore.